Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the Chinese Squadron vehicle, the WZ-122MC. Now you notice I'm calling it WZ instead of object like the game does. I've never seen the Chinese military use the designation object, and every time I've seen this tank referred to, it's always referred to as the WZ. So we're just going to be using that for this video, and Gaijin might even change it to WZ at one point in the future, but that's very semantic. And as a small bit of bookkeeping for the channel as a whole, it was brought up to me in the comment section that some of my videos were showing up as a max of 480. I have corrected this, all future videos it should be fixed, but thanks for bringing that up. I do check the comments and I do like to get feedback like that. Now, as far as the WZ itself, it's important to realize that this is a squadron vehicle. So how squadron vehicles work is they're separated from the tech tree. You don't research them the way you research tech tree vehicles. Instead, you select one of the vehicles that is available from the squadron vehicles to put your squadron RP towards, and depending on your squadron activity, you'll get a certain amount of RP towards it like every few days. You still have to purchase it with silver once it's unlocked. It is important to note that even though these vehicles are kind of sort of off to the side with the premium vehicles, they are not premium vehicles. They don't get premium silver or RP earn rates. They don't efficiently research all vehicles below them. They only research the normal one above or below, and they don't start with all of their modifications. So these are significant when you're considering whether or not you should get a squadron vehicle. And starting off with the basics of the WZ, what does the armor profile look like? The armor profile of the WZ is actually quite good. The armor profile, as far as the upper front plate, you don't have any major weak points, and it's relatively thick. The lower front plate itself is also pretty decent. The turret directly next to the barrel is pretty weak, however, it slopes out pretty far, so it's like shots a little bit too far to the left or right of the turret will still fail to pen for quite a few shells. Now, there are a lot of enemies that just have straight up armor negating shells that you'll run into, like APF SDS or heat rounds that have particularly high pen. However, there are going to be a lot of enemies, especially in 8.3, given how often you see down tiers, where you can just bully them around, and this includes a lot of the later tier heavies, some of the earlier Cold War vehicles in the 7.3 to 7.7 range. So overall, I found the armor profile of this vehicle to be pretty efficient and pretty usable, and it also seems to survive hits quite a bit. So as far as durability, I actually really like the WZ-122. One kind of meta thing about the WZ-122 is that it's not exactly the most common vehicle, except the T-55 that it sort of looks like is a very common vehicle, and people are probably used to T-55s, which is why I have noticed a lot of people who can't really upper front plate a 122, but can upper front plate T-25, have shot the upper front plate and basically done no damage, because it does have noticeably better armor. It's not in any way consistent, but it will save you from time to time. On the mobility front, the WZ-122 has a pretty good top speed, but its acceleration isn't quite good enough to consistently hit that top speed. So most of the time you'll hover between around 30 and 40 kilometers an hour. This is pretty fine, it'll get you where you need to go. It's reasonably responsive, especially once you get all the upgrades installed, although it can feel a little sluggish stock. The only real downside to the mobility is really when you start talking about the reverse gear. The reverse gear is pretty bad and can be kind of painful at times. But overall, I'd say the mobility is pretty good. Now, as far as firepower, when we look specifically at the main gun, it's fully stabilized, you have a laser rangefinder, you have night vision, although this BR doesn't ever see night maps, or at least the entire time spading it and getting footage for this, I never once saw a night map. So it's nice to have night vision if you're using higher tier lineups, but doesn't generally matter. The big thing to note about this and the really cool feature is that you start with an APF SDS round stock, and this APF SDS round pens a maximum of 285 millimeters. This can deal with a lot of opponents pretty easily, but it's also noteworthy that you have a rank 1 APF SDS you can research that has a max pen of around 350 millimeters, and that will go through almost everything you could conceivably meet like a hot knife through butter. There are very few vehicles that you can't just click on the middle and destroy them. Additionally, it's an APF SDS round, it has a very high muzzle velocity, and this means that it has a very flat trajectory, so even at long ranges, it's easy to land your shots. Even if targets are moving, it's easy to land your shots because you have a very short travel time. Overall, this is a really solid gun for this battle rating. While the gun is quite good, one of the most notable features about this vehicle is the missiles. You have 2 guided missiles on either side of your barrel for a total of 4. These guided missiles are pretty interesting because they're in addition to your main gun, so you just have 4 guided missiles ready to go all times. Additionally, the guided missiles, while they're relatively slow, they do have a good bit of pen and a good bit of explosive mass, so they can deal with the vast majority of enemies you'll meet pretty easily. Now, the guided missiles themselves, one thing that you really want to note is the firing sequence, because they are pretty far apart from the barrel, and you aim them the same way you would with the barrel. So you kind of have to know in what order they're firing, especially if you're peeking around like corners or obstacles. So the order they're firing is going to be top left, top right, bottom right, bottom left. Or to put that in simpler terms, the first and last missile will always come from the left-hand side. So it's also important to remember that when you're reloading, the missiles will reload in reverse order. So the bottom left will reload first, then the bottom right will reload. So it's also pretty noteworthy. One final thing to note about the missiles is that you can't simply ripple fire all of them at once. There is a bit of a lag between firing missiles. This doesn't usually matter, as it takes enough time to guide a missile to target that usually by the time that happens, the second missile will be available fairly shortly thereafter, but it is noteworthy. Originally, I thought the missiles would be something of a gimmick, because honestly their performance just isn't anything impressive. However, when taken in conjunction with the fact that your gun works in almost all situations, they effectively end up being less of a main weapon and more of a backup weapon. And just being able to emergency fire missiles if either A, you've crippled an opponent but haven't killed them, if you see multiple opponents, if somebody knocks out your barrel, these are all very useful situations. You can also kind of not take heat or high explosive rounds and just use the missiles as essentially a heat or high explosive round. So instead of having to go through the process of like rechambering a new shell, you just fire a missile at the target. And overall, I really like how this functions in game. The missiles just add a lot of versatility to a lot of engagements. They give you options that you wouldn't normally have. The big watchword for this vehicle in terms of its performance as a whole would be incredibly versatile. So at long ranges, your armor becomes more effective against a wider array of shells. Your gun never stops being effective against any enemy you can fight. You have a laser rangefinder, you have a stabilizer, so you can afford to jostle your tank back and forth to make it difficult for the enemy to land precise shots, and you can still pretty accurately land yours. Once you go into medium range, your armor maybe is a little less effective against certain opponents. However, your gun still works, and the missiles also become a really viable backup option because at longer ranges, their slow travel time makes them a little awkward. And then you get into close range, and the armor, the missiles, the gun all makes for a really effective brawling package, because even if the enemy tries to barrel you, you still have the backup missiles. And a lot of people underestimate the fact that the missiles have a very short repair timer. So a lot of times, if a lot of systems are down, you will get the missiles back online pretty quick, although it is important to note that the missiles share the horizontal and vertical elevation with the gun, so if those get knocked out, it will be very difficult to aim the missiles. But you will get them online a lot faster than the gun, and this means you kind of get hung out to dry a lot less frequently than you do with like some other tanks. If you were to ask me, should you invest Squadron research into it? Honestly, this is like the second best Squadron vehicle you can research, at least for ground. The BMP-2M I would say is the best just because it's kind of busted, but the 122 is, it's not that far behind it. For its battle rating, it's incredibly versatile, and while China has a pretty competitive lineups in the 8.0 to 8.7 range, this vehicle still manages to stand out as being particularly good in my opinion. So if you have the Chinese tech tree, or honestly even if you don't, because it is kind of a unique gameplay experience in the context of the game, I do think this is a pretty worthwhile option. However, if you're not in a squadron with high activity and you're asking me should you spend Golden Eagles for it, that's a much dodgier question, because for the Golden Eagles you would spend researching this, you could get a premium vehicle that has premium earn rates, researches almost the entire tech tree, if not the entire tech tree, and overall, and just has all the upgrades stock, so you don't really have to worry about any of that stuff. It's hard to really say if this would be a better buy than something like WMA 301. But it is still a good vehicle, it still has a place in a few different lineups, so I don't think it would be a demonstrably bad decision, but it kind of just depends on where you're at personally. And that concludes our video for today, everybody. Hope you learned something, hope you had fun, and I hope you enjoy playing the WZ-122. I really like it. It's probably one of my favorite vehicles to play for China around this battle rating, and I've had some good success with it. So, hope you enjoy it, hope you had fun. Have a nice day, everybody.